I'm honoured to make this introduction to the presentation for Madrid Affordable Housing Activation, May 2022, on behalf of the UIA Architecture for All Work Programme, Region 3, Canada, by Representative Ron Wickman. First Nations housing, affordable and appropriate. I am Alan Kong, Co-Director of the UIA Architecture for All Work Programme and Co-Chair of the Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria, and thus have a great deal of interest in this topic. I speak to you today from the unceded lands of the Wathaurong, the First Nations of southern part of the state of Victoria, Australia. It is customary for us before meetings to acknowledge the First Nations custodians of the countries throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, seas and skies, and pay our respects to them and to elders past, present and emerging. I reiterate the objectives of the Architecture for All Work Programme: to encourage and promote equal access to the built environment, to remove barriers that create segregation, and to achieve sustainable buildings and places which are friendly, accessible and understandable to everyone, to share knowledge of good practice and innovation in accessible and inclusive design, to work towards UN Sustainable Goal 11, cities and human settlements that are inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. We refer to the Royal Architects Institute of Canada website, where President John Brown says, "It is our responsibility to build relationships with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect and cooperation and partnership. Learning more about Indigenous culture, history and languages is crucial to developing a common understanding and opening the door to respectful relationships." The Affordable Housing Activations Madrid identifies a number of barriers to housing affordability: mismatch, ownership and tenure, policies and regulations, financing and social sustainability, along with accessibility. Without doubt, First Peoples, nations and people living with disabilities face all of these in great measure. This short presentation by Ron Wickman is an introduction to the issue, which will form a clear pathways to providing solutions for the future. Thank you, Ron.
Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Canada. My name is Ron Wickman. I live in a city, Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, towards the west part of our country. And I'm pleased to do a short presentation for you on some of the initiatives that are happening here in our country in regards to affordable and accessible housing, especially in regards to our First Nations communities here in the country as well. Just a little background on myself. I am an architect. I've been practicing for almost 30 years now. My practice is completely focused on accessible design, which takes me from small renovation projects for people's homes to larger projects like large housing projects. In 2020, I was able to finish and publish a book called Accessible Architecture, Beyond the Ramp, and it is a high-level view of accessibility looking at residential, public buildings, urban and community planning. Here's just a short sampling of some of the projects that I have been involved with. My practice is small, so I tend not to be involved in too many larger projects as the architect. Sometimes I am the barrier-free design consultant on larger projects, but my work allows me to pretty much every day work with clients who have disabilities. The reason I became interested in accessibility as an architect in the first place was because my father used a wheelchair. He was 23 years old when he was injured. I was only a few months old, and I only knew my father as somebody who used a wheelchair. And I'm 57 now, and I'm old enough to have been in the city of Edmonton where there were no curb ramps and no real accessible features at all in our city. And it's very important when we look at accessibility that we look at it from many points of view. There are many types of disabilities, and we have to think about all of the disabilities simultaneously as we design for trying to accommodate as many people as possible. And the best way that we can design is to have that lived experience, actually work with the people who have disabilities. And speaking of that, I have been involved in the last 5 years quite heavily in our First Nations communities and trying to come up with new ideas to create housing that is affordable and accessible, especially for their elder population. In many of the communities in Canada, housing is at a crisis. They're older housing units, they're in disrepair, and it's very difficult to get things fixed up. The current government in Canada has made it their mandate and mission to help solve many of these issues. And these are the sorts of things that I've been working on as an architect in my own way. Again, there are many people living in a single house, which is creating problems. Infrastructure is problematic in many communities, what they call on reserve. And there's also obstacles to the housing, lack of funding, lack of political will sometimes. Again, having said that, our current government is very much committed to solving some of these issues. Some of the other issues that are happening, the Canadian government has the National Housing Strategy, which looks at affordable housing specifically, and then looks more specifically to accessibility issues, green architecture, sustainable issues, and our First Nations communities. We have a group that works for the Canadian government called Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC. And this is where most of the research and funding and development is happening within the affordable housing sector and our First Nations communities. In Canada, we have the Canadian Standards Association, which creates an accessibility set of guidelines. We have a group called the Rick Hansen Foundation. Rick Hansen, over 30 years ago, from his wheelchair, wheeled around the world and has since raised millions and millions of dollars for spinal cord research and initiatives that allow us to get better housing for people with disabilities. Our national architectural organization is called the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. And in recent years, they've also made it a mandate to advocate to architects that the issues around First Nations groups is dire, and we need to be doing something about it as architects. My presentation will really focus, though, on the CMHC, or the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and some of their strategies and initiatives that they've been working on. In terms of affordable and accessible housing, they have the National Housing Strategy, where many millions of dollars are being spent to deal with these issues. Generally speaking, the governments at all levels in Canada tend to stay away from the housing market in terms of supplying housing. And so they rely on different funding models and initiatives to get the industry to build housing that is more affordable and accessible. So again, the commitment of CMHC is to create an affordable housing initiative, housing that is energy efficient and sustainable, and housing that is inclusive and accessible, and also dealing very directly with issues around homelessness, where many people who are homeless are also First Nations people. Again, the private sector, developers, builders can gain access to potential funding that allows them to build this type of housing that is affordable and accessible. A great deal of research, again, the Federal Community Housing Initiative, Community Housing Transformation Center, and Research and Planning Fund. So a great deal of money is being spent to encourage architects and other designers, developers, builders to really look seriously at creating a more affordable housing type. Demonstration projects are something that I'm particularly keen on, actually building products and homes that people can visit and see for themselves and see how nice they are, how beautiful they are, how sustainable they are, and how accessible and flexible for many different types of people. In terms of our First Nations population or Indigenous population, we really look at the two sectors, which is on reserve and off reserve. On reserve is problematic in that a lot is government funded and relies a lot on the community members to create the housing, but they don't always have the funding that allows them to build proper infrastructure like water and other infrastructure, and that makes affordable housing quite difficult. Again, a great deal of money is spent on providing communities with funding to renovate and repair. Often that is just to bring the house up to standards that can withstand our colder climate here in Canada. But often that money, there's just not enough money to do the repairs and modifications that would allow aging in place for the elderly population or any other member of the community that might have a disability. So we really need to address these issues, and we're slowly getting closer and closer to doing that. So at all levels of government in Canada, they are looking at this issue very seriously. And what I'd like to do in closing is just show you one project that I was involved with that captures the spirit of these initiatives that I was telling you about with Canada Mortgage and Housing. This is a housing project in Edmonton, and it was designed for people who would have been formerly homeless. This particular not-for-profit group that relied on funding from various levels of government knew and understood that many people who are homeless have disabilities and use wheelchairs sometimes. And so they worked very hard to make sure that this housing project would accommodate as many people as possible in the best way possible. And unfortunately, in many of our bigger urban centers in Canada, a large population of people who are homeless come from Indigenous or First Nations communities. And so this project in particular was the not-for-profit group is a First Nations group, and primarily the clientele or residents within this project are people with a First Nations background. And what was very moving for me as an architect was to have a client that really understood the needs of people who are homeless and understood the needs of people who have disabilities. So we worked very well together in terms of creating a housing model that would allow people to access all parts of the building and enjoy all parts of the building and maintain a cultural heritage to the building itself. It's a very simple building. It's 4 stories, it's 42 dwellings, a mixture of bachelor, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom units. The important thing about this project was that every resident had their own bathroom and kitchen. So it really is independent living. And the idea is to allow residents to have a stable home life that would allow them to work towards perhaps upgrading their education and eventually finding work and another type of housing. And we were able to make it affordable because of the strong desire from government to help us financially. And we were able to make it more accessible for the residents because of the not-for-profit group that worked so hard to make sure that every single resident was accommodated in the best way possible. Thank you so much. I know it was very brief, just gives you a very brief outline again of what's happening here in Canada. It's difficult times, but it's also exciting times to see that we are taking this issue seriously, and hopefully in years to come we'll see real results of positive housing models that can be used around the world. On the screen right now is my contact information. Please, if you ever want to, reach out to me by my email address, and certainly visit my website where there's quite a bit more information about the work that I do in the accessible world. Thank you so much. And for those of you that are in Madrid, enjoy the time there. And I hope you enjoyed this short presentation. Thank you.